Ladies and gentlemen, Governor Walz, a very warm welcome to the Clingendael Institute, and of course it is my special pleasure to welcome Governor Tim Walz from Minnesota to join us today. So today, as some of you may know, we celebrate the birthday of George Washington. It's President's Day. Tim Walz is the 41st governor of the state of Minnesota, a position he has held since 2019. Before that, he was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, but of course, many of you will be familiar with him as vice presidential candidate in the 2024 elections. Now, Governor Walz has joined us today to discuss basically two things. Firstly, the future of transatlantic relations in the context of our common climate challenge. What does this mean for clean industrial strategy, the energy transition, and opportunities to work together? And also, Governor Walz is here to help us better understand how states, separate from the U.S. federal government, can play a role in fostering deeper transatlantic cooperation. And this is key, as this aligns very nicely with our ambitions at the Clingendael Institute with our Clingendael U.S. program, CUSP for short. So CUSP has three ambitions. One, provide relevant analyses on the state of the transatlantic relationship. See, for instance, the recent survey on Dutch attitudes towards that relationship. Two, convene meetings and conferences like this to exchange ideas and to learn from each other. And thirdly, to build a network across the U.S., not just in Washington, D.C., to form a better understanding of developments inside the U.S. and how they affect our common transatlantic bond. And that means both at the federal and the state levels, as we feel, particularly these days, that to fully understand dynamics inside the U.S., we need to engage with all levels of government. And so it is a great pleasure to focus on Minnesota today. Now, Minnesota and the Netherlands share important connections, not in the least due to the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed in 2023 between Minnesota and the province of Brabant on medtech cooperation. Minnesota is also freezing cold. It is, at the moment, minus 24 centigrade in Minneapolis. A bit colder than here, but Governor Walz, to make you feel welcome, we have dialed down our thermostat a little bit. And due to climate change, it is unfortunately quite rare that we are still able to speed skate on the lakes and canals, but these couple of days that you're here in the Netherlands, you might actually get a glimpse of that. So on your social media feed, I saw that over the weekend you took a very, very cold plunge somewhere in Minnesota. But we hope very much that your trip today to Europe will be a warm bath. So finally, the rules of the road. Governor Walz is going to deliver his keynote remarks. After that, the head of our EU and Global Affairs unit, Dr. Louise van Schaik, who is also our lead researcher on climate and sustainability policies, will continue the conversation with Governor Walz before opening up to the audience for questions and comments. And also, we have press here. This conversation is on the record. Governor Walz, thank you very much for joining us here today. You have the floor.
Well, good afternoon. Dr. Korteweg, thank you, and thank you to Clingendael for this invitation. It is truly a privilege. Dr. van Schaik, it was wonderful to, I know we're going to have a great conversation, but upstairs we had a bit of a conversation, and I will have to say in full disclosure, Chairman de Hochschäfer, your reputation amongst the global diplomatic community is well known. I mentioned to him I wished he was in Paris, not with me today, maybe to speak to the moment we're in. To each of you, thank you. Thanks for taking time out of your busy lives to come. I appreciate that, and I would be, I think, remiss if I missed the moment that we're in. This is, I think, for many of us, unprecedented in the transatlantic relationships. There is a potential realignment globally that we have not seen certainly for not the past 80 years. And I think to be here in this moment is not lost upon me. And I'm going to offer what I think are some possible ways forward of shared values and tackling some of the toughest issues that we face. I will say yesterday we landed after I did jump through that hole in the lake, but it was for a good cause. For that, so I don't just do that as like casually on the weekends. It was to raise money for something to jump in a hole in a lake. But we did that and then landed, and my team built us in some time, and we went to the Anne Frank house. I had been there many years ago as a younger man, and I said it felt like when I visited then, it was a historical experience. It felt like when I'm visiting today, it was a cautionary tale, and that is maybe the moment that we're in. And so I want to propose to you. I'm here today as governor of Minnesota. My team had it in there. They said, "Are you going to mention, how dare you show yourself after the terrible defeat you took or whatever?" And they were talking about the 2022 World Cup loss that we suffered, and as Americans, when it comes to soccer. I was happy we were in the round of 16. That seemed pretty good. So, but I think talking a little bit about Minnesota, and it's something we don't do a lot. I always tell people, if you want to, and I think we feel most comfortable here because there's a lot of water. Because if you want to find Minnesota, you just find the world's largest freshwater lake, and that's us, Lake Superior. We got 10,000 more of them. We care deeply about this. A few years back, the New York Times did an analysis, and they said after the climate zombie apocalypse happens, the best place in the world to live would be Duluth, Minnesota, on the Great Lakes and clean water, arable land. And I thought, I don't know if that's a really proud thing for us to brag about, that if all things go to hell, you can at least come to Duluth, Minnesota. But what's interesting is you can board a ship in Rotterdam and disembark in Duluth. That is the western terminus of the Atlantic Seaway and the St. Lawrence Seaway. That port of Duluth is where the iron industry of Minnesota sprung up. We've got about 90,000 Minnesotans of Dutch heritage that have come. I mentioned my wife lived in western Minnesota, and it was a large concentration of Dutch Reform that came from the Dutch Reformed Church. And wonderful people, and not a damn one of them ever voted for me. I know that. And so I knew that about it. But we have ties. The ties are very deep. And I think one of the things is we do over $1 billion worth of business together. 7,000 Minnesotans work in over a dozen Dutch companies. And I had the pleasure this morning to be down at Philips headquarters. And Philips just recently announced a major expansion in Plymouth, Minnesota, where they're building some of the catheters, the heart catheters, to go with their imaging. That's going to be a major expansion in Minnesota. And one of the reasons that they're there is because Minnesota is the hub, the global hub of medical device, whether it's Medtronic, 3M. A lot of that type of work is being done there. We have a lot of our companies here. 3M does business here, Cargill does business. So that's pretty well established. But I also think those ties that go way back, I mentioned that iron ore industry. That was the iron that built the tanks that were in Europe as we fought side by side to make sure that our shared values were protected, to make sure that we were there to push back against tyranny. Those things have been going on a long time. But we also pride ourselves much, I think, like we see here in the Netherlands, and if no one, innovation. Creative innovation of moving towards the future, seeing what we can do with medical technology, with AI. Minnesota's very proud of it. We invented the pacemaker. We were home to Norman Borlaug in the Green Revolution on biotechnology. And when we had spare time on the weekends, we invented water skiing in Minnesota. So we're the ones who did that. But the challenges that face us now, and I think all of us see this, the existential threat around climate change is very real. And Minnesotans certainly see that. The existential threat to leaving a planet to our children that is habitable, you can see that. But I also know that folks here know it. What's good for the planet is also good for business. The opportunity to be able to deliver a clean energy economy while also transforming that economy that benefits more people. We believe in it wholeheartedly. And so I know that it was and I appreciate you mentioning this, I am not the vice president. If I was, I would have given a very different speech in Munich this week, I can tell you that. But I am not. But what I am as the governor of Minnesota can tell you that that speech that was given is not the majority opinion. That's not the majority opinion where Americans land. That's a political opinion. It's certainly the current opinion and the current U.S. policy that was delivered. But I think when you get past that, and certainly I don't say get past the security and NATO and all that like it's a small thing, the grounding and the connections and the desire to solve these problems is just as strong, if not more now. And what we heard is, I think, an area that's been neglected, and I would suggest to you today, and I'll hear whatever, and I want to leave the bulk of the time for you to ask questions. I would argue that the solution is to interact with sub-federal levels of government, and especially states. States in the United States have a huge capacity to make a difference. As a governor, we have the power to shape our policies. We have the power to move resources where they need to, and we have the power to engage the conversation like we're doing here. It's why we're in Phillips, why we were with them, why we will continue to seek out partnerships that deal with this, so we can make a difference on it. I would tell you this, we have to do that, and I was with the mayor this morning, and when we see folks who are making those decisions, we do not have the luxury of just having talking points. We have got to deliver on the things that impact people's lives the most. So I would just tell you this. We heard during a presidential campaign that, and again, the vast majority of Americans clearly understand climate change is real. But when they heard that gas prices were too high, which when you see American gas prices, I know that you laugh about how ridiculously low they are. Everything is about your perspective, I guess. Drill, baby, drill isn't going to solve a damn thing. It is not going to address the issues we need. It's not going to reduce the cost for things. It's not going to make a big difference. And so when we hear the current administration talking about this, they may be hell-bent on taking us down a fiery path of climate destruction, but the vast majority of Americans are not. And as governor of a state, whether it be the state of Minnesota, the state of California, states that are leaning into addressing climate change, we have an awful lot of impact to make. And I was sharing a statistic earlier, maybe just to make myself feel better. The states that voted for Vice President Harris and myself make up over 2/3 of the American economy. We are the economic engine of the country. We make up the biggest difference. And those states are not turning away from addressing climate change. They're not turning away from innovation. In fact, I can tell you from our perspective in Minnesota, we feel even stronger about it. The last time the Trump administration pulled us out of the Paris Accords, our response was, as states and mayors, to join together and continue that progress and continue those goals by keeping us on track to meet our 2050 goals of which we're doing. We took it a step further in Minnesota, and in our 2023 legislative session, we crafted the most aggressive climate legislation in the country, going for 2040 clean energy by making sure we're incentivizing our ability to decarbonize across all sectors. One of the things that we are still very proud of, we are the center of the iron and steel industry. It's not Pennsylvania, it's not Pittsburgh. That's where they blast furnace and refined it. We're the ones that mine it in our iron range. We are moving towards initiatives around green steel and the ability to decarbonize that industry. That's the third largest impact into carbon emissions of any industry. Couple that with agriculture, where we are now a hydrogen hub that we are partnering with Midwestern states, heavy in agriculture, because our state, we're the leading producers of corn and soybean, a major global food source. We're going to decarbonize that industry. And we're also, we have representatives here from Delta Airlines, which we were mentioning tight ties to KLM and all of the things that are there. Delta Airlines is a leading partner of building a coalition that is going to have Minnesota be the global hub of sustainable aviation fuel, of the biofuels necessary to move us forward to decarbonize air travel. So we're tackling these on all fronts. We're making major investments in those. All of those things are outside of the federal government. Now, we certainly can count on and need to have federal funding, but I would also tell you this, those states that voted for Vice President Harris and that make up 2/3 of the economy, those are also states that pay more into the federal government than they get back out of the federal government. because the economies are stronger, they're more diverse like ours, which leaves those states in a position of looking for partners, looking for the ability to do things together on this. We were able to get a Canadian company, Helene, that is the largest, North America's largest manufacturer of solar panels, to build in Minnesota. And starting to use that power to say states that are going to address global climate change are now more committed. States are more willing to partner and find those partners to make a difference. You're seeing business communities in these states not shying away, because not only is it the right thing for Delta to decarbonize, it's the right thing economically for them to be able to find that renewable fuel source as close to possible as where one of their global hubs is. So we're able to do that. And a lot of these things come out because we have created, much like you've done here, we see these partnerships. We have something called Greater MSP. We have Medical Alley. We are the concentration of, as I said, the largest concentration of medical device manufacturers. And it is centered around an ecosystem with the University of Minnesota that has spun out companies like 3M from the University of Minnesota. It's that commitment to public education, commitment to that land-grant university, coupled with the Mayo Clinic, coupled with the innovation that surrounds that is creating the largest concentration. I heard this morning when we were down at Brainport talking about that it was the highest concentration of education and most educated people in one space. That is true in Minnesota around this issue of biomedical, and then all of the engineering that comes out of that. So as we move towards and think about a clean energy future, we think about the spinoffs and a healthier, you can't talk about being the best state. We have the best medical ranked at the top, the best medical access and services of any state in the country in Minnesota. But if you don't address climate change, where we have more days of clean air alerts than we've ever had last year, our children can't go outside if they have asthma, our farmers can't grow their crops because our growing season is so changed. We went in a 5-year period for having 2 of the driest years on record to massive flooding last summer. And that is just the way it is. So those are folks that are no longer debating climate change. They're asking, what can we do together to address it? So it is, I would make the case that in this environment, it is even more, there's even more of a sense of urgency amongst our states as we see the federal government turn away. I gave the story where in 2015, I traveled to China on a congressional mission with Nancy Pelosi, and we addressed a group of college students in an auditorium at Beijing University, and the topic was climate change and how we could partner together to do something about it. There was not a single climate denier in that whole room, obviously. You don't sit in Beijing and deny climate change when you can't breathe. You see what's happening. You understand what needs to move forward. So the opportunities are there. So what I would say, you're hearing it from our federal government, that they're all about resisting China and fighting China. And every decision they make actually plays right into their hands, actually falls right into that. Here's some statistics for you. China now controls 80% of the global solar panel market and 3/4 of the global electric vehicle market, and they're not slowing down. And America's solution on the federal level right now is to tweet and put tariffs on. Minnesota's solution is to partner for solutions with people to actually make a difference and show a reduction. And I think you're going to see these competing ideas play themselves out, but if I'm betting, I'm gonna bet on innovation. I'm gonna bet on that these are not going to change. I'm going to bet on that the Chinese are not going to turn away from their attempt to make sure they are positioned for the future. And look, this isn't all about bashing China, that's not it. But I have no illusion whatsoever that the leverage that's being gained economically by the Chinese is not going to be used to further the human rights or to further the free speech, further the ability of both Chinese and any area where they have influence on to move towards a more liberal democracy. It's simply not going to happen. So whether it's security issues, whether it's economic issues, or whether it's the climate issues, all of the interests that we care about in those shared values are going to have to be addressed by finding those solutions. So I would tell all of you, we are a medium-sized state. We're about size of the UK. We got about 6 million people. I was going to use the statistic that Lake Superior is twice as big as the Netherlands. And I didn't mean that like disrespect. It's like how big this is. And we have 20% of all of the world's fresh water resides in the upper Midwest and in Minnesota. We feel a sense of responsibility around how we're going to deal with this. And we feel a sense of responsibility of people who understand it. We were mentioning as we traveled through the Netherlands, water is as important here as it is for us. The ability to move water, control water, clean water, all those things that happen. There's a natural mix there. So we came, and I came with a group of folks from the Mayo Clinic, from Delta Airlines, from innovative companies that are looking to continue that partnership because I think those values are there. And so in a world that looks chaotic, I can assure you of this. States like Minnesota and the majority of folks still believe we need to address these issues. They still see the value of our partnerships. They still understand that a global order is not just going to be rearranged through security agreements. They're going to be rearranged for who's tackling the most pressing problems, who's at the forefront of solving these things. And in Minnesota, I'm pretty proud that our major industries are dealing with food production and food security. We're dealing with biomedical and biomedical research, and we're dealing with figuring out ways that we can be part of the solution around climate change. So in a time when I know you turn on the news, it seems pretty bleak, there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic, and I've encouraged some of these leaders and the folks that we meet with to use the system that exists in the United States. If the federal government is choosing to go a different direction, we still have the capacity on many fronts to address these issues. So there's not just going to be shutting off, we're no longer part of this. We're going to be able to target to work together. And so I would, again, suggest that this actually opens up an incredible opportunity for those who wish to move in a direction of sustainability, wish to move in a direction of more collaboration and cooperation, that door is still open, but we're going to have to prove it that it works. We're going to have to show it for our citizens that we're getting benefit from this. So I'm just grateful to be with all of you. I look forward to a set of very easy questions. The chairman will be glad to answer them. So.
Okay, is this on? Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this was really a brilliant overview. And when looking into your CV, I mean, you have had so much experience as the governor, but also as a teacher and as a military. And I think that also really inspires people. And I'm also really happy with the audience that we have today. So many people also from the private sector, from diplomats, from journalists. So I'm really looking forward to the broader conversation that we can have with you. I think it was really fascinating that you mentioned, you know, we're open for business, and we welcome representatives from the Netherlands and from Europe. I guess that's really something that we've been hearing from the private sector in the past years, because we heard a lot about this famous Inflation Reduction Act. There were so many companies here in Europe that said, that's great, it's a tax credit, it's so easy, you can see what you get if you make an investment there. There were, you know, big corporates that were making the calculations of how much cheaper it would be if they would set up a new factory in the US than it would be in Europe. And now these stories, you don't hear them anymore. Everybody has turned really quiet. We know that like many other policies, the Inflation Reduction Act is kind of in the freezer. So the question would be, is there also still something that is on offer if companies would consider to invest and make especially these green investments in Minnesota?
Yeah, it's a great question, and that Inflation Reduction Act, and this is a case I would credit. It was individual countries, but the EU as a whole did a really nice job of lobbying on that, because if you recall, some of you in here who are experts in this on the front end, the Inflation Reduction Act was really great, except it excluded everybody who wasn't in the United States, which it was global changing. I knew the Inflation Reduction Act was a big deal. I went to an Aspen climate summit in Miami, and I sat on a panel with a bunch of bankers in the World Bank, and I'm like, why am I on here with them or whatever? They were making the case that for the first time we were reaching a tipping point on investment private capital that was actually going to make a difference. And they felt if the Inflation Reduction Act, that's when we were still trying to open it up to more of our partners, would be the moment that the world would tip in that direction. Well, we've seen it too, and we're worried about this as state government. They're reaching in and pulling back those grants. Anything, if you say something is clean energy, they will pull it back. So I'm telling my team, find things that are really bad, like a nuclear waste dump, and tell them that that's a clean energy project, because they'll fund it and pull it out then if they think it's, because they don't want anything to do with it, like they turn away. We are nervous about it, but what we did something, and I have Commissioner Verlick with me, we have a Department of Employment and Economic Development. We were able in 2023, kind of anticipating some of this and trying to have value added. The state of Minnesota now has the capacity, and we work with them. We have the trade office that's here. We work to try and say if there's things we can do. So we can do some things at local entities around taxation, but there's things we can do for training, help to hire, if you relocate, and we put those packages together. That's what we did with Helene, the solar manufacturer. That's what we just saw. The Sherco project is the largest solar project in the upper Midwest. We just turned the lights on that. Those are things that the state is still able to help with. So the answer is yes, but I will just be candid with you. We don't, obviously a state like Minnesota, where yearly budget's about $35 billion US is what our budgets look like. So we're a pretty good sized economy, but I do think we have the capacity to put packages together. We can help on some of the land acquisition. We can help on making it easier in the transition. And we're viewing it now that this team has got guidance from me. Go out, and we're not negotiating with you. Go out and tell us what you need to move to Minnesota if you want to do that, and we'll help try and put it together. And our advantage is, much like you're doing the same thing here, is you have a cluster and an ecosystem that is super unique. You could try and go build anywhere you want, but it's more difficult if that infrastructure is not there. So the answer is yes, we do have capacity, we do have the ability, and we want to hear, if you're thinking about it, give us a chance.
Right, thanks. Well, that I think will also lead to some follow-up questions on these issues. I actually wanted to follow up on the China issue. We have the Clean Industrial Deal coming up in Europe, most likely to be published next week on Wednesday. And many of us are expecting that there will be more of a made in Europe policy in this Clean Industrial Deal. That if new funding in the future will be made available for clean investments, both for greening the current industries, but also for the new clean tech sector, that we need to protect this sector better from the overcapacity in China, the subsidies for the electrical vehicles, the solar panels, you talked about it, and also about the American choices in that regard. But how would you, what would you recommend us, and how would you say we should include the transatlantic relationship in such a strategy?
Yeah, upstairs we had a little more, a broader discussion on this. Look, I think it's understandable, and this is maybe opportunities domestically for Europe to think about Buy Europe. I have a good friend, we border with Canada. He said, you've done more for Canadian nationalism in the last 3 weeks than we've ever seen. They're fired up. But look, we're picking fights with friends. I mentioned upstairs, one of the things is America's isolationism is America's unwillingness. I'm a global geography teacher, so I my life goal to explain those global connections. Americans don't really know that. If you ask Americans how much of our budget goes to foreign aid, they'll tell you it's half, and it's really 1/10 of 1%. I think you'd even ask Minnesotans what's our biggest trading partner, they wouldn't say Canada. So I worry about this because I think it's totally understandable if you're going to be retaliatory. What I mentioned upstairs is what's really a unique situation is that I go back to that of those states that share your values around clean energy and things. They're looking for partners. They're looking for some of that help. And I think we should try and figure out if there's ways we can keep these partnerships going and the trade, because otherwise you're going to have to look for partners. I mean, I don't understand the strategy. If this is to be a counterweight to China, it feels like we're just empowering them and they're going to step into the void because we're leaving that void, both, global leadership, soft power, but investments, economic investments. So I would say, if at all possible, try and use the leverage with you have. Look, if you trade with California, that's the 5th largest economy in the world. Again, I think about what the economic impact, and it's not unified. And while there is federal policy, we still have a lot of autonomy. So I think the issue here is to be more specific about where you're investing, how you're finding your partners. And I think for us to think about that. Again, we're going to buy this in. No, you're not. Nobody's going to make it in America because it doesn't work that way. And, the tariffs, I'm a geography teacher, but if I had to go back at it again, I would require economics in our schools because we obviously do not understand it. The last election proved that. So,
yeah, I think what is also really fascinating is that Minnesota is so big in the steel industry, in the iron ore. And we've just seen the tariffs, but we also spoke about the prospect of green steel, of hydrogen. And here in the Netherlands, we also have a steel factory. There is also a plea being made for this being based on hydrogen from the offshore wind of the North Sea. But it still proves to be very costly and difficult. So how do you view the steel industry links between Europe and the US, and also the prospects of learning from each other and the prospects of turning the green steel dream into a reality?
Yeah, and again, this isn't, I said that many of us have lived through clean coal, the oxymoron of clean coal. But there is possibility on green steel. There is the reductions are there. The technology is there, and it looks like some of the capital starting to flow to it. The issue with the steel industry is that the scope and scale of it to make it profitable really does require that partnership. We're going through a really weird, because of our nationalism, Nippon Steel is trying to buy U.S. Steel, and I swear, I believe this, if U.S. Steel were named anything else but U.S. Steel, no one would have said anything and they would have let them invest. It's true, because it's U.S. Steel. It's like, that's U.S. Steel. That's the heart of who we are. It's that it hasn't been that way for a long time, but it's that real. Those partnerships are there looking for that. I would say encourage, that is a very concentrated industry. There aren't a lot of players in it. But this quest to try and create green steel, because, again, all of what we're going to need, not disingenuous in this. I drove here. I flew up, in a plane to come here, so it's not that at all. But we're searching for those answers. I want to fly in that plane that's on sustainable aviation fuel. I want to make sure that we're reducing our footprint wherever we can, and that's that whole chain. Green steel is a key to this. That's the frames to the cars. That's the solar panels in that. But it's all of our building construction, which we know, between the concrete industry and steel, those are two heavy carbon producers that we think we can make a difference in. So on this one, I would encourage you to take a look at folks who are trying to tackle this. This thing's slowed in America right now just because of, Nippon Steel owning U.S. Steel. If that were Acme Steel Corporation, they already would have acquired it. So.
Yeah. If I listen to you, I think you are a true believer of what we in Europe called for a long time the European Green Deal, the idea of green growth, that you invest in sustainability, that it will make your economy stronger. What we've observed among the European voters is that this idea has also been confronted with some skepticism, the idea that not everybody can afford to buy a Tesla, or well, maybe now today they don't want it anymore, but the idea that if you rent a place that you don't have the abilities to refurbish it in such a way that it uses less gas. so
how do you recharge in an apartment?
Yeah, how do you really also talk with the voters that have sincere concerns about these benefits of the green transitions, and if it is not only a costly affair, but it will also bring benefits to them?
This is the fundamental question, because I believe the vast majority of people want to do right, and the vast majority of people believe in climate change. What I've said is they also want to come in the room, and they want to be able to turn on the light, they want it to come on, and then they want to open up their bill, and they want it to be affordable. So once renewable energy reached parity pricing, which we knew it takes some investment, it takes some subsidies to get there in the beginning to get it up off the ground, that it starts to make a difference. I think the mistake we made early on in talking about this is, I did it as a teacher. Some of you, do we have teachers in here? We have a few, right? That have been, a couple. A few of us with no money, I see you. But there's a famous learning thing, Maslow's hierarchy, Abraham Maslow's learning, and it said up here is self-actualization, like we have to deal with this to create that. But it says you can't ever get to that if you're worrying about being eaten by the tigers. You can't worry about that if no one likes you and you have no social interactions. And so we need to make the case. We always sold clean energy. It was the right thing to do, and it was that. We always need to sell it because I believe people are there, but you can't ask people to sacrifice and to give more if they're not seeing the personal benefit to a certain degree. So I said we need to make the case that it's economic growth. And in my congressional district where I represented, as big as any country almost, we were one of the leading areas on wind power and wind generation. The first windmills in America basically went up out in Minnesota, and it had a real economic benefit in small towns. It had an economic benefit for farmers, and we started to see the return on it. So it was a case of, you don't have to choose this. If you don't choose wind or you don't choose clean energy, you're a bad person and you should pay more. We made the case that if we do this, we can produce energy here, make money, and reduce your taxes and create clean energy. And I think we have to do a better job of moving in that direction. We have to do a better job of making the case that this is an economic imperative. Because again, I've got voters, drill, baby, drill. We don't have any oil in Minnesota. So you're not going to make any money off that. But we do have wind. We do have solar. We do have a lot of water. We do have the capability to innovate, and we should be there. So I think it's a matter of selling it on those impacts and then making sure we do understand the disparities around this, and especially in communities that pay the brunt of this. Because we've consistently, in America, we do this. I have 2 nuclear plants in my state, and that's a whole other can of worms to talk about, but trying to get to our goals without nuclear power is very difficult. The problem is the storage issue, and we have never dealt with that. And again, before we talk about nuclear power, if we could solve the storage issue, you get a lot more buy-in from people, and then they're willing to move forward.
I think it's really remarkable that you mentioned we don't have oil in Minnesota, because this is the case for most of Europe. We hardly have any fossil reserves. So for us, let's say this economic imperative is also really supplemented by the security imperative, that we want to reduce our dependency on petrostates, the first of all, Russia. But what we have done in the past years is we have replaced our dependency on Russian gas also by LNG from the US. And First, there were even talks about freedom fuels. Well, the Europeans said, no, we don't want to call it like this because we also want to reduce, in the long run, fossil fuels. And now Ursula von der Leyen has said, because we have the trade deficit with the US as part of the overall negotiation strategy, maybe we can even buy a little bit more of this LNG to make up. But other people say, well, this makes us also more vulnerable for blackmailing, because every dependency that's increased is also a liability for Europe. Would you have a perspective on this difficult security issue for Europe?
Yeah, the energy security issue is a big thing. And look, that's my biggest concern, and I will speak more on this tomorrow a little bit, that my biggest concern is, you're probably asking now, can we trust America? Can we trust their word? Will they leave us hanging? What happens? And if you bet your future on energy outside, one of our things, your credibility is how trustworthy you are, how you can be counted on. I think I'm hearing people say that that's not necessarily the case. LNG is kind of a challenging one because the pure climate folks who care about this say you're not really getting any closer, but it is a bridge fuel. It is cleaner than the other alternatives that haven't been developed as far as they should. But I'm saying the same thing to my folks, that it makes no sense for us to be dependent. And I'm looking at it nationally, but even statewide, we should be as energy independent as we possibly can. And I can tell you economically, it's a little bit of a segue away from this. Another issue that's a bit of a challenge is data storage, and data centers. Shouldn't surprise you, Minnesota is a hub of data centers because it's cold. We have a tax credit around data centers. But the reason they're coming to Minnesota is they've made a clean energy pledge, and in Minnesota they can get 100% of their power through renewable energy. And so I'm making the case that as we create more renewable energy, we are becoming a magnet for pulling folks in who only want to invest in clean energy and they only want their factory to be there. So we're getting the payoff like that. And again, I might not be able to sell a big solar farm as being the best thing ever for a community, because there aren't a ton of jobs that come out of that. But if that solar farm results in a several billion-dollar investment in technology and data center for AI, that's a little easier to sell. So what I would tell you is, again, being as energy independent as you possibly can is certainly the way to go. We're in a brave new world that it pains me to think that you're wondering who's more dependable, Russia or America, in this. That is a challenging spot. I'm here to try and tell you the majority opinion is that we are still dependable allies. We've been at this a long time, but we're going to have to be creative how we build those relationships.
Right, thank you. I'm going to open up for questions of the room. Maybe just a small question, well, not really small, but you mentioned you have tax credits for data center. Would you also have something like that in the future, possibly for renewable energy investments, or do you plan maybe like we have in the EU, kind of polluter pays policy? Is that possible for the state level?
Yes, I think that's exactly right, and that's the direction we have to go. We're rethinking this now with the lack of the IRA money, the things that were coming in to help us federally, but again, figuring out how we incentivize and want to be the hub for that. It's part of what they did, and the reason that I'm going to give credit to Delta Airlines. Jeff Davidman's here. Delta Airlines helped build this coalition around what it would take to be a leader in sustainable aviation fuel, and at the heart of that was the nation's best tax credit. So I will just be candid with you. We are not known for tax credits as much in Minnesota. I was mentioning I had a political opponent who one time attacked me, and in a debate or a conversation we were having said, well, Tim is trying to turn Minnesota into a Northern European economy. And I was like, yeah, I was kind of agreeing. But the point being is, we have relatively high personal income taxes compared to, but we don't have taxes on clothing. We don't have taxes on food. And we're focusing on like R&D tax credits. Tax credits for things like sustainable aviation fuel. So the answer to that is yes. I think that's the direction that we're going to need to go.
Okay, thank you. We have Diederik here. He has the microphone, so I would like to ask who dares to ask a question. And I would like to ask you, maybe if you pose the question, that you introduce yourself, and also that it's really a question, not a big comment or statement. I see here one on the front row and then in the back. Yeah.
Yes, hello, Governor Walz. Casper Thomas from the Dutch weekly The Amsterdammer, former US correspondent. The story that you tell, of course, fares better, the type of EU or European US bond fares better with a different electoral outcome in the United States, of course, 4 years down the line, provided that will still be an option with a free and fair election. What has been your main takeaway from the autopsy of the Democratic defeat during the presidential election?
I'm glad we started with an easy one.
Shall we maybe collect one more question in the back?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Yes, Governor Walz, very pleased you are here. I'm representing the technological industry, an association is that, also Philips is a member. But if you look at the incentives you give, if you do the comparison, American companies have 20% more growth in profit compared with European ones. Also, the turnover growth is 40% higher. Now we see the trade war coming on, and I'm also a former CEO of a steel company for 12 years. I've been there before when the first tariffs were imposed, and this can spread further. And my point of view is, how can you influence with the 2/3 of states which are willing to do this transition and become greener, but also be for more open trade? What can you influence on this? Because this imposure, everyone will end with echo on their face. So my question is, what can you do with your other supporters, the 2/3 of the supporters, to change this?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And look, the federal government's just sheer power to invest. It's the money. It's the money power as much as anything. I think what I make the case is that we have to both incentivize, we have to do the best we can, whether it's tax credits, but I also think we have to create the climate that makes it so you can be successful. And what I mean by that is we're really focused on workforce development, because it's a challenge for all northern economies. It's a challenge for us. Look, we're old and white. That's what's happening. So trying to make sure that we are growing that tech base, make sure we're growing that workforce that's there, make sure that we're making life better for them, like affordable housing, like free college that we do in Minnesota, free school meals. Those are not social programs of handouts. That is building the future workforce. And I think talking about states who are doing that we need to make it, because there are penalties that go into that, make it cheaper for you to do business there, make it more effective, and make you more competitive. And that's a segue to go back to maybe this first question. I think our policies are better. I think our policies impact people's lives, and we've got the data to support it. I think talking about paid family and medical leave, investments in higher education, child care, clean energy, better investments in transportation was a powerful message. I was somewhat surprised that they're eating dogs and cats appeared to be a more powerful message to people. The message was a hopeful, joyful future where we gather together, could not push back against this global kind of anti-incumbency and just a malaise that have come on to people. It goes back to what you're saying is we can have the best laid plans, but if we can't show results, if we can't show a reduction in the cost of your electric bill, if we can't show that we're getting more energy from clean energy, and if we can't articulate that for whatever reason, we're not being able to, as you said, the Democratic Party or progressives are not conveying to the voting public. I have a 17-year-old at home, and we were in one of those parent things where I was giving him advice and showing him I'm right, and he stopped in the middle of it and says, "Well, says the guy who lost to Donald Trump." And I'm like, that's too, if I had all the answers, but it did somewhat shock me is that we were making a populist message to the working class about a future that seems very uncertain. about ways that we could make their lives better and reduce their cost. And it did not resonate, at least enough. I don't want to say it did not because, relatively tight elections in America, which they normally are, it did resonate, but not enough to pull people off the sidelines, which, I think it plays into the hand that government doesn't work and things are bad and people just stay home. That plays into the hand of folks who don't see that. And so we're going to have to do a better job of messaging that. We're going to have to do a better job of, again, this idea of isolation and trade wars. And I'll be the first to tell you, we've had a polar flip in America kind of on trade. In the 80s and 90s, and even with Bill Clinton as president, Democrats were very protective. We were protective of our trade unions. We were very protective, especially agriculture. We didn't want to be there. And Republicans were free traders, this global economy. They wanted to do it. Well, the global economy brought a lot of positives in it, but some of the negatives. Now the Republicans turned to the isolationism, and Democrats recognized that the positives of global trade, the relationships there, the lifting people out of poverty, did benefit all of us. So we're in this weird juxtaposition of how do we make the case. So I think the way out of this is we're not going to out-national them, but we are going to out-results them is what we have to do. We've got to show that for all their bluster and all their talk, unless I said this, I think we got to be open to this. Maybe picking trade wars with all of your friends, throwing away 80 years of relationships, undermining everything we had, telling people that, gas prices are going to go down to $1 a gallon or whatever. I guess we leave open the possibility that they might be right and it's going to work. But I don't believe that. And I think at some point in time, it's going to be evident that it didn't work. And we need to be ready to message that there's a better way forward. There's a more collaborative way forward. There's a more shared prosperity way forward. But right now, it's not falling on as many ears as I wished it would have. So.
Thank you, and thank you also for being so honest. And I wish that every responsible politician would have such a teenager that sometimes has this mirror perspective.
He won that argument because I was like, okay, you're right. So.
All right, questions. In the back, 3 in a row. Maybe we can take the 4 questions. And then we also have to round off, please.
Clingendael Institute. Governor Walz, I was very curious when you talked about you passing a very ambitious green transition goal for the state of Minnesota. Yeah. And you also talked a lot about, on a national level, how it's very difficult to work with Republicans on climate goals, how they're very, very anti-green transition at the moment. But I was very curious if you experienced the same thing in the state legislature in Minnesota with state-level Republicans. Is there a possibility of closer collaboration there? Is there a divergence of views? Do Republicans in Minnesota have a diverging view of how to tackle climate change, have a different perspective on climate change than on a national level?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I'm going to go quick on this one. Look, I came from a district. When I was in Congress, Donald Trump won my congressional district by 18 points, and I won it. It's like 50,000 people voted for him and me. It keeps me up at night. But I was able to work together on that. That has shrunk and shrunk and shrunk more, and I want to just be clear on this. That clean legislation that we passed, I don't believe I got a single Republican vote. I did something that Democrats aren't known for. We had a 1-vote majority in our state house and in our state senate, and a 3-vote majority in our state house. And and somebody said, "Well, what do you call a 1-vote majority?" I said, "A majority. We're doing it." And we just did everything. And just went with the power we were given. And it was something that I will say this, they might have learned from us because that's what they're doing right now, but it did make a difference. So I wished I could tell you there was a possibility for more collaboration, but it blows my mind, the resistance to things that so make sense, that so get there. But here's what I say is, what we did have in Minnesota was the business community that tends to be more conservative, that tends to lean more to the right, but a very realistic business community that understood their bottom line was dependent on tackling climate change and doing this. They have been incredibly helpful. And that's the new alliances and the new coalitions that we're building, because it is weird right now. And I've served in Congress when it wasn't quite this bad. There is just a one-track way of doing it with no compromise. And I don't know. You just have to win elections. If you don't win elections, you go home, and that is not a good thing.
Here in Europe, it's slightly less polarized, I would say. With
Or for 4 years you cry that you actually did win, but that's another story.
Please, the next question.
Chief Economist of ABN AMRO Bank, bank here in the Netherlands. So I'm wondering, do you have policy instruments at your disposal, and which ones would there be that you can use to cushion the blow of the tariff impact? So, for example, in Europe we have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is also a kind of a tariff for green steel, for example, or cement. So is there an opening of having kind of a bilateral trade agreement or something that you would call different, I guess?
I think that's right. That's why, and people, look, we have to adhere to the federal rules that they're in, but there's a lot of things that we can do. The thing is that, I tell you this, in America, we don't have a lot of those mechanisms, and I'm just going to tell you, I think Americans' tolerance for pain around economic sanctions is untested, if you will. When you start to feel the pain, you start to see things differently. And I think I'm seeing our allies, I mean, my God, the Canadians are just coming with a sledgehammer about it, you know, and they went right at it. They said, oh, that Kentucky bourbon, they had all the TV cameras there to take it all off the shelves. And that actually hit. That's a big industry in Tennessee and Kentucky, and they went right after the alcohol first thing. So what I think is that we don't have a lot to suffer, but we have a lot of ability. And I'm going to encourage you to do this. The Canadians were very specific about their retaliation. We are not taking it out on blue states. I hate that it's come to that, but that's a way to build the coalition of folks who share your values of saying they're not punishing. They're not punishing us because we agree with you that this trade war is stupid.
Okay. Next question.
And I'm a reporter with the Dutch newspaper Nederlands Dagblad. And you mentioned that during the first Trump administration, kind of the progressive or democratic states were forming a coalition to lead the fight on climate policies. That was 80 years ago, and the climate crisis didn't take a break in the meanwhile. Yeah. What have you kind of learned from that first Trump term, and what are the states now maybe going to do differently to approach the climate change fight?
Yeah, what I've learned to never say it can't get worse. I've learned to say that because it obviously can. I think that also we learned a lot on collaboration among states during the COVID crisis, where we saw the federal government not willing to help. States were partnering together on things like personal protective equipment, on testing, where we had, resources like the Mayo Clinic to be able to help. I think we strengthened our bonds. One of the groups that I belong to, for example, that is now reconstituting itself is the Great Lakes governors and premiers, where we're working cross-border on protection of the Great Lakes. I think we're starting to understand better about how we can partner amongst ourselves. But this is going to be different this time because it appears like they're more targeted in their punitive nature to this. So I guess we're going to see. If you haven't noticed, the governors that get criticized are the governors of California, the governor of New York, the governor of Minnesota. It's very specific about this. But what I would tell you is all of the policies they're putting in place are hitting harder in the red states because they don't have the safety nets in place to be able to absorb some of that, whether it's food assistance, those types of things. So what you're going to see is the 50 United States are really, in many ways, a lot of individual or regional economies that collaborate together, and to see what comes out of that, if you're seeing more of those types of collaborations.
Right, thank you. The final question for today.
Mr. Walz, okay. My name is Marieke Stellinga. I'm an economic journalist for NRC, a Dutch newspaper. I hear your optimism about the green transition and also the greening of your industries in Minnesota. But you talked about green steel and sustainable aviation fuel. These are very hard to green industries. They are far from being in the money. So do you really think you can make green steel happen in Minnesota without federal assistance and with freezing, for instance, of the wind industry in the US?
No, it's a good question. And look, we're realists. It's 26 below zero in Minnesota. So we are very real about how things happen. But our take on this is somebody's going to have to take these on. And there's something to be said. Yes, I think the answer is yes. We think we can do this. Yes, we're willing to do it. I will come back again when it comes to sustainable aviation fuel. Our major partners are XL Energy, our largest producer. It's Delta Airlines, one of the world's largest airlines. It is Ecolab, the world's leading producer around water and clean water, that we believe we've got the partners there and the commitment to it. But what I'm telling you is we could sure use some more help. We could sure use some more collaboration and cooperation. These are the things, when I was in Beijing in 2015, the point in being there is this is an area where China and the United States are partnering together. We could make a huge impact. And it seemed hopeful then. Little did I know that by 2024, just because I could speak a little Chinese and live there, it would be like I was the devil or something, like there was no intention of trying to collaborate together. We're searching for partners to try and solve these. These two are particularly well suited for us geographically and skill set wise. That's why we're going to tackle them. But I'm under no illusion. They're both going to be incredibly difficult. I would segue to one more that's the third one in this, one of the biggest carbon problems is fertilizer in our agriculture industry. Decarbonizing the fertilizer industry through the hydrogen hub is another one of those big goals. It's a big one, but all three of those are the issues. And I think if we're putting in solar fields, we're getting to 2040 clean energy. We have got to keep, if the federal government's not going to do it, states are out there to try and do it. And I'm trying to make the case that there's opportunities to make money in these investments. So we're going to try it, but no, I'm not naive. Those are two hard ones. If Jeff's here, he could tell you the statistics better than me. If we had every single gallon of sustainable aviation fuel, it might fly me back to Minneapolis today. We understand that the scale we're talking about is massive, but I just don't think there's any way around other than somebody trying to tackle it. And right now, we've got a federal government saying drill, baby, drill, and climate change isn't real and all kinds of other things. And states are just trying to pick it up.
All right. Thank you so much. What's that?
It's something. So mostly my job's getting yelled at, but I do get to do one thing that is really fun. As a governor of Minnesota, I get to issue the license plates for our cars. So Clingendael has their own license plate. So there you go. You're personalized. So.
Well,
there you go. Thank you. That was fabulous.